Hello mortals, it's Discordian Kitty, and today I wanted to talk about the topic I touched on in my last video because I'm clearly a masochist, the subject of faction imbalance in modern World of Warcraft storytelling. And no, this does not mean I'm about to go on about alliance bias or accuse the devs of hating the Horde or anything like that, but I do think the Horde has been suffering in the story lately. If you're a returning viewer, you've probably already have heard some complaints about, well, let's just say an overabundance of alliance focus in the War Within story, even when it's a bit weird, like Matthias Shaw's role in Undermine. And with Midnight on its way, that trend is already looking a bit like it's set to continue, with an alliance family being described as very much central to Midnight's story. Does that mean I believe Midnight is dead on arrival because it isn't going to be hostile enough to Alliance players? No, not at all. I'll be frank, you could make Anduin Wrynn the new High King of the Blood Elves and I would still be excited about our return to Quel'Thalas. I just love Silvermoon that much. I've also, believe it or not, never been a big fan of the faction war. But I would like to talk a little bit about the identity crisis the Horde has been going through, examine why it's happening, what even is happening, and what might happen in the future. Let's start with the faction imbalance in the War Within. The War Within has been undeniably pretty alliance focused. Almost all major characters are alliance, even our Delve companion. Thrall was on the cover art for the expansion, but mostly all he's gotten to do is show up to be Anduin's emotional support orc. For the most part, this hasn't necessarily been a problem. When it comes to World of Warcraft storytelling, I will always personally prefer Blizzard to tell a story that makes sense, that needed to be told, instead of just trying to tick little boxes that say equal faction representation on them. If we're going to tell a story that involves both the Earthen and Xal'atath, then of course revisiting the story of the dwarves, especially those dwarves who were once Xal'atath's victims, makes perfect sense. Visiting the Arathi without involving Anduin would have been a massive disservice. As for Alleria, while I might personally be getting a little tired of her, I won't deny she's been chosen well. While plenty of characters could have been just as good at going head-to-head with Xal'atath, Alleria is a character with direct links to the Void, the Ethereal of Koresh, the Army of the Light, and the Blood Elves of Silvermoon. The only major story beat from the Worldsoul saga so far that she hasn't had a direct link to is Undermine, which is why it's very weird to me that they didn't bring in Thrall for that. Thrall's lack of participation in the War Within has become a bit of a meme. There have been comparisons to Bane's role in the Shadowlands, literally sitting around, which isn't entirely fair. Thrall has been active, just not necessarily in a way that involves a lot of questing with players. For example, the story Heartlands covers the work he and Jaina did to find those allies who joined us in the War Within's max level campaign. I have also idly wondered if some of his story has simply been moved. There's been a lot of speculation that the Haranir story was moved from the War Within to Midnight. After all, the Midnight Zone named Harandar sounds an awful lot like the Rootland Zone that was rumored to have been found in early data mining for the War Within. We already know Thrall is going to be a Midnight according to a developer interview that Cybear TV did with Maria Hamilton and Ian Hazakostas, so it's always possible his story was moved as well. Even if it was, it does still feel extremely weird that Thrall never did make it to Undermine. Not only are Gazlowe and Thrall old friends, Gazlowe helped Thrall establish Orgrimmar. Even before officially joining the Horde, Gazlowe was the contractor who Thrall would routinely call on whenever he needed help establishing a Horde outpost. You would think, at the very least, he'd be interested in showing Thrall around his home city. You'd also think, after so much focus on Alliance characters and stories, the Goblin Zone would finally have some space for the Horde. Instead, Undermine went to great lengths to reassure Alliance players that this wasn't a Horde patch. So much so that I found myself, a Horde Goblin member of the Bilgewater cartel, being reassured that not all Bilgewater are part of the Horde. Blizzard dug up their one Alliance goblin to be not only a main character but to act as Gaslow's moral voice of reason. Worst of all, the entire patch wrapped up with a visit from Matthias Shaw and included this really bizarre bit where what is supposed to be a Horde leader tells the head of the Alliance secret police that he owes him one.
Hey, Shaw, you ever need anything, I owe you one.
That's a dangerous thing to say to the spy master of Stormwind.
It's so weird and unnecessary. Even Matthias is like, "Are you sure?" Remember how I said I would rather stories that make sense than stories where Blizzard seems to be trying to tick little boxes that say equal faction representation on them? Part of me feels like that is what went wrong with Undermine. Blizzard were trying so hard not to alienate Alliance players, they ended up inserting Alliance characters that honestly had no reason to be there. They were working so hard to assure Alliance players that they're not part of the Horde, they forgot about the Horde players that actually are part of the Horde by choice. Part of the problem is everyone's bias makes everyone else's bias seem more biased. So bias is a very loaded word. People hate being told they're biased. They tend to take it very badly as if it's a grave insult. Admittedly, quite often it is. But the fact is, we are all biased. It's part of being human or goblin or you know what I mean. Nobody views the world with absolute clarity. We are all shaped by our experiences, the culture we live in, the time period we were born into, the things our peers say, etc. Do I think Blizzard really has an Alliance bias right now? Maybe some of the writers do. Maybe some have a Horde bias. I'm going to use an example that I always feel a little bad about bringing up because I know it was a mistake. But during the Return to Gilnea's questline, Kalia Menethil was referred to as Queen Kalia. This was quickly fixed, and the writer of the quest came out to say it was a completely unintentional mistake that they only made because they were exhausted. It's still a mistake not a single Forsaken player that I know would have made. You only make a slip-up like that if, on some level, that's how you think of Kalia. In general, as much as I actually personally really like Kalia as a character because I think she has so much potential to be a great villain, the fact that it seemed like they wanted to position her to be some sort of replacement of Sylvanas, even naming her the Pallid Lady and assigning her a champion, always felt bizarre. It was like they'd never spoken to a Forsaken player, which was really the problem. The whole thing felt like it was lacking a certain amount of Forsaken bias. On the other hand, we players cannot deny the fact that if anyone's the most guilty of bias, it's probably us. For example, I really didn't like being reassured that the Bilgewater weren't part of the Horde, because I am a Bilgewater Goblin, and I chose that race partly because I wanted to be part of the Horde. I found it mildly insulting. Not in a serious way because it's a video game and I'm not 4 years old, but enough for it to be a line that very slightly bugs me. And because of that irritation, I was already pretty biased when, during the Gamescom Midnight Developer panel, I heard Maria Hamilton introduce the Blood Elves like this.
So our first culture to talk about is Blood Elves. Those of you that don't play Horde may not know a lot about the Blood Elves. This is your opportunity to rectify that.
Straight away, this bugged me. And I am self-aware enough to know that at no point was Maria Hamilton intending to single out the Alliance as if they're the only players worth addressing. She was just worried about the traditionally Horde setting, race, and city alienating the Alliance, and so wanted to reassure them that this is going to be positive. But my first character was a Blood Elf. And to me, this really felt like just an incredibly odd way to introduce one of World of Warcraft's oldest and most established playable races, as if they're a brand new race that most of the audience will be unfamiliar with. And again, Maria Hamilton has done absolutely nothing wrong. It is certainly not her job to manage every weird emotion random players have. But do you see how my bias affected my experience here? And I'm fairly easygoing as far as the faction divide goes. The reality is, a lot of players are always going to end up feeling like Blizzard is biased against them, no matter what, And there's honestly nothing Blizzard can reasonably do about it. Which is kinda why I actually wish they'd stop trying. I can't help but personally believe Undermine's story would have been a lot better if they didn't keep trying to reassure the Alliance that it wasn't a Horde story. And they may have intended nothing of the sort. This could just be my impression because of my bias, but still. If I do believe there's a problem of faction imbalance, I absolutely do not think the solution is to add token representation. So how do you fix it? Well, you see, the problem is, this isn't about the faction war. One response that I always get when I bring up the subject is a lot of comments assuming I want to bring back the faction war. I guarantee I'll have those comments on this video, which really frustrates me because I don't. And yes, that admission itself is going to horrify some of you, but I have never felt that the faction war is the most interesting thing about World of Warcraft. In fact, my argument has always been that the factions should be trusted to have a strong enough identity outside of the faction war. Amping up the conflict between the factions may be a cheap and easy temporary fix, but I don't believe it fixes the core issue, which is that Blizzard is struggling to define the Horde specifically outside of its conflict with the Alliance. And Blizzard are not the only ones. A lot of players are guilty of this as well. As an example, the reassurance that at least some of Silvermoon will remain exclusively Horde. This helps the Horde feel like they at least have something that the Alliance don't have. It's almost a consolation prize for the whole an Alliance family is going to be central to the story thing. I would prefer a decent bit of Horde storytelling though. Nobody has to be crowbarred in. Heaven knows I don't want a Matthias Shaw in Undermine situation, but there are a fair few Horde characters who are relevant to any story about Quel'Thalas, and I would hope that we do get to see them where it makes sense. Like, Thalishra is a character whose name I did kinda hope would come up by now. You know, Lorthamer's wife. Even if it is just to let us know that after that horrible honeymoon, she's filed for divorce. Of course, it's impossible to know where Midnight Story is really going to go, so while I've given my initial concerns based on my early impressions, understand that nothing is set in stone, and getting prematurely upset before we even know what the story is actually going to look like would be a bit of a waste of everyone's energy. But without even going into Midnight Story, I think it has been obvious for a while that the winding down of the faction war has damaged faction identity and that the Horde have suffered the most. Part of the reason for this problem is obvious. Warcraft's very first game was called Orcs vs Humans. The war in Warcraft always originally referred very specifically to the faction war that the Horde started when they invaded Azeroth. A lot of people, and for that matter characters, still see World of Warcraft's factions through this lens. Garrosh was one of them. He viewed the Horde as the conquering orcs who built a road of Draenei bones on Draenor and who came to Azeroth to conquer. Never mind the fact that the Horde he so admired were slaves to the Legion. Never mind the fact that they ended up destroying their home and almost completely losing large part of their cultures, all because of this obsession with a war that wasn't even theirs to begin with. Never mind the fact that the modern Horde was built from multiple different races, generally outcasts, who had found solidarity with each other. Garrosh decided that the Horde was warmongering orcs especially, and anyone who wasn't a warmongering orc wasn't part of the true Horde. And a lot of players agreed with him, partly because this was the Horde that they joined. But it was never the Horde I joined. I started playing during Warcraft 3. My war chief was Thrall, a leader who knew the importance of setting aside faction differences in favor of fighting a greater threat. I've often argued that this, far more than the war between the factions, has been central to Warcraft's story since Warcraft 3. It is certainly central to the story of some of Warcraft's best expansions. Thrall's natural successor was always Vol'jin, whose people joined the Horde not out of a desire for conquest, but through the need for allies. This theme was repeated over and over to form the Horde that I know. Sylvanas wrote to both Alliance and Horde to find new allies, but it was only the Horde who responded and allowed the Forsaken to join them. One unlikely ally led to another, bringing the Blood Elves into the Horde. And Vol'jin had the potential to be an even better war chief than Thrall. The fact that Thrall still held onto some outdated ideas about the Horde is the reason why he made a decision as terrible as making Garrosh war chief. Vol'jin understood the new Horde's principle of found family. We're not necessarily allies because we get along particularly well, or are the strongest, or share similar cultures, because we often don't. We're allies because we need each other. Which is why it will forever be so devastating that when Vol'jin was made war chief, Blizzard didn't seem to know what to do with him. Or the Horde, for that matter. So instead, they spent an expansion lingering over the old Horde before killing Vol'jin off and replacing him with Garrosh 2.0. We all know how that went down, and now that Sylvanas is no longer war chief, the Horde have replaced her with the Horde Council, the most uninspiring change in leadership since Keir Starmer took over Labour. But I've just been going on about found family and working together. You'd think I'd be all for this more representative form of leadership. But I'm not. Partly because in a fantasy game, something like a war chief is always going to make a stronger statement than something like a council. Partly because the only time we rarely ever see the council is during external media. You could actually present a council to players in a way that makes them feel impressive and real, but the game hasn't done that. Instead, the council barely features in-game. The Alliance may not have a High King right now thanks to Anduin taking his gap years, but at least they can visit Stormwind Keep to find Turalyon sitting on the throne. The most representation of the Horde Council I've been able to find in Grommash Hold is Rokon, the current leader of the Darkspear. Usually standing with some characters who are actually supposed to be dead. But I concede a council could still work if it wasn't for the fact that Horde leadership is in crisis. Horde leadership doesn't feel strong right now, partly because our leaders keep dying. There are several memes about it. But a lot of their replacements have also repeatedly failed to be strongly Horde. I'll bring up the Forsaken Council again. The two members who have gotten the most focus are Lillian Voss and Kalia Menethil. Kalia's problems are obvious. She's not Forsaken, she's never been Forsaken, she's never going to be Forsaken. But Lillian is almost as bad. She's a new Forsaken who originally chose not to be part of the faction. And she spends a lot of her time working with the Alliance, helping the Alliance, comforting the Alliance, and assisting the Alliance in establishing a geopolitical foothold. I don't think anyone, Alliance or Horde, wanted the Forsaken to be so involved in the reclamation of Gilnea's questline. It was weird, a decision that felt like it existed to tick representation boxes, which ultimately created poor representation and left everyone feeling unsatisfied. I am fine with the Alliance and Horde being at peace. I just don't think Forsaken leadership's biggest political move since replacing Sylvanas should be stuff that mostly just politically benefits the Alliance. In the same way, I think the only time Gazla's position on the Horde Council was mentioned in Undermine was when he was taking the time to reaffirm that his cartel isn't necessarily all part of the Horde. And also, he owes the head of the Alliance Secret Police. I'm sorry, but it doesn't matter how much peace you've had. Strong leadership doesn't go around telling heads of historical political enemies' secret police that they owe them favors. Again, this doesn't mean Horde leadership needs to go back to try burning down every Alliance city they see. They just need to show some basic indication that their priority is their own people, and not constantly reassuring the Alliance. If the Alliance need reassurance, well, their own leadership can do that. I don't actually think it's impossible for the Horde Council to work. Narratively, I think it could be very well done, especially if conflict within the council leads to unintended and disastrous consequences. But to have conflict, you need debate. To have debate, you need people with strong opinions. If you want a strong council, you need it to be made up of strong leaders. All the Horde Council has really done is expose how weak or untested a lot of their leadership is. Which is a shame, because the Horde does have strong leaders. They just haven't been present in the story a whole lot lately. Lorthamar's portrayal in the Midnight Cinematic is a good start. Hopefully we'll see more of that going forward. Horde leaders fighting for their people, prioritizing their people, leading their people. Maybe seeing more of the stronger members of the council could help make the council feel a bit more inspiring, but it might just be easiest to bring back a war chief. And okay, I'll be fair here, maybe Alliance leadership hasn't been the absolute strongest lately either. Part of the reason why Horde players are getting sick of following Alliance characters around lately is because these Alliance characters are basically behaving like they're faction neutral. Anduin is as happy to hang out with my Forsaken Shadow Priest as he is my Dwarf Paladin. The older Alliance leaders may not have all died, but a ton of them have been replaced. And of course, there is no High King at the moment, just Terralion. If Alliance identity is suffering as much as Horde identity, I do still think it's based on the same problem. These factions are struggling to define themselves outside of a hatred for one another. So maybe this is about the faction war. I have always believed faction identity can be strong enough to survive an end to the faction war, that anything defined only by its hatred for something else isn't worth much. But I do have to admit, I am growing worried that the factions' identities aren't that strong after all. Look at the Forsaken. Their name is a reference to the way they've been rejected by the living. They are Forsaken. But they aren't anymore. Not really. The Alliance and the Horde are at peace. Even Gain Greymane has learned the difference between Mindless Scourge and the Horde's undead. So if the Forsaken aren't defined by their fight for survival against a world that has forsaken them anymore, then what does define them? What makes them Forsaken? Look at the Blood Elves. Once they were part of the Alliance, and they've considered rejoining before. The only reason they didn't is because Jaina turned on the Blood Elves in Dalaran.
She's gone too far. I'm certain the Alliance can move their war mages through the city at will. That human witch! When will they learn? When will they see that the Horde exists because of the Alliance? Because of their prejudice and their bigotry? They force us ever closer to Hellscream's Horde.
But Jaina got over her anti-Horde sentiment long ago, and Quel'Thalas still has that long history with the Alliance. Alliance elves, like Arator, live in Silvermoon City. We already know plenty of Alliance elves are going to play a major role in Midnight's story. Even Umbrek and the Void Elves, who were exiled from Silvermoon, seems like they're positioned to set aside their differences and make a return. But if the Blood Elves no longer feel forced into the arms of the Horde because of Alliance bigotry, then what's keeping them there? Ultimately, World of Warcraft, like any story, needs conflict. Faction conflict is one of the easiest go-to ways to provide players with story that also creates a strong sense of identity. Yes, there's always the greater threat, but if everyone's fighting against it in one army, that doesn't give the individuals fighting against it a strong sense of personal identity. We're all just cogs in the same machine, faceless humanoid members of the Army of the Light. Which, again, I don't want to dwell too much on what we know about Midnight's story so far, but apparently we do start the expansion by joining this army that shows up in this cinematic, the Army of the Light. And Valen's prophecy about the war between the light and the darkness, the war we're facing right now, included Anduin and Rin leading both factions in the Army of the Light, Alliance and Horde, as if he is the High King of everyone. The weaker the Horde's position gets in the storytelling, the more worrying this particular vision becomes, at least for anyone who still cares about the continuing existence of the Horde. What bothers me most is, I'm not sure I can tell you for certain why the Blood Elves should remain part of the Horde, apart from because I want them to. Yes, there was the purging of Dalaran, but Blizzard themselves seem a little bit unclear on whether or not they want to consider that canon. And besides, it's something that the in-game characters seem to have moved on from. Ever since the trading post was introduced, Archmage Aether's Sunreaver, the leader of the Blood Elf Mages of Dalaran, can be seen buying a gift for Jaina, and the two seem perfectly amiable these days. I can't even tell why I think there should still be a Horde. This is not a position I enjoy being in. I find it a bit depressing, but I really do find myself at a bit of a loss. If the Horde no longer feels the need to conquer, and it no longer needs to fight for its own survival, then why is it needed? I'm not trying to be controversial here. Maybe you have an answer for me. I do know that I'm not happy now, but also the last time the Horde faction was absolutely defined completely by its conflict with the Alliance, I was miserable. I hated Battle for Azeroth. It was the most narratively depressing expansion I've ever played, and I'm including Shadowlands in that. I can appreciate a lot of players don't feel the same way and would be thrilled to return to exactly that. I'm not saying my view is the only right view, but to me at least, bringing back a BFA-style faction conflict wouldn't ever be the solution I'd want. So what do I want? Well, I find myself wondering, is the focus in the wrong place? And then I think back to the last time the line between the factions felt a little blurred to me and how much I actually enjoyed it. It was during Legion. And yes, Legion did almost do away with the official peace between the Alliance and Horde right away with the events on the Broken Shore, but in our class Order Whores, we were working together. But every class Order Whore had an extremely strong identity that worked for that class, and sometimes conflicted with other classes, even when people were from the same faction. That was the experience that made Anduin believe he could create some peace between the Alliance humans and the Horde's Forsaken. He had learned to work alongside an undead priest. The discomfort he felt with the undead softened by the work they'd done as priests. It was also the experience that made me believe the factions could survive a peace. I enjoyed working with characters that were from the opposite faction that were part of my class, partly because they only helped me feel the stronger connection to my class. And maybe this is the problem. You can set aside the faction war, but if you want players to feel a strong sense of identity, you need to replace it with something. I've joked about Midnight scraping the bottom of the barrel to find every Alliance elf they can unearth just to make them the main characters of the Horde's own story, but maybe the important thing is this focus on the elves. I'm never going to be happy about Undermine's weird assurances to the Alliance, but Undermine did leave me feeling proud to play a goblin. It remains one of my favorite patches of all time, so no matter how much I complain about Matthias Shaw, they must have done something right. Maybe it didn't leave me with a strong sense of what it is to be part of the Horde, but maybe that strong sense of what it is to be a goblin could be enough. There are also places where Blizzard have managed to tell very strong Horde stories that don't revolve around the faction war. The Orc Heritage questline is an example. That's not about being part of the Horde, but it is about being an Orc, and it's hard to play it without feeling incredibly proud to be one, or at least to have a very cool Orc ult that you're definitely at least a bit emotionally invested in. Maybe this is how you give factions a strong sense of identity again. If you can't focus on a war with the other faction, you focus on the other things that define them, that make them unique. The Horde Council doesn't have a strong presence because a lot of the Horde leaders on the Council simply don't have a strong presence. In the same way, the Horde won't have a strong sense of identity if the various groups that make up the Horde don't have strong identities themselves. If Blizzard really does want to keep the factions in an official peace, and it does feel like they do for practical reasons, yes, there are conflicts here and there, but we're already sharing guilds and we're about to share neighborhoods. Another Battle for Azeroth situation could get a bit awkward when you're officially fighting a war against your own neighbor. Then maybe they need to put more work into giving players other ways to feel a strong sense of identity again. Everyone doing the same quest lines, following the same characters, wearing the same uniform, fighting in the same army, isn't going to help anyone, Alliance or Horde, feel like the story cares specifically about them, no matter how many times you call them champion. I'll never understand why they decided not to make the class Order Whores evergreen content. I mean, I do understand different quest lines and Order Whores for every single class was probably an insane amount of work that they just didn't want to give themselves again, but I still think retiring the Order Whores was one of the worst things that they ever did. They might at least consider returning to separate quest lines for the Alliance and Horde, because at the moment, when the quest lines are almost identical, it doesn't feel like it matters what faction you've chosen, and players do kind of want meaningful choice, at least here. Maybe Blizzard are hoping neighborhoods themselves will give us something like a strong identity, After all, everyone's neighborhood will end up being different, and there's a lot of potential to start feeling shared accomplishments as your neighborhood works on achieving certain goals together. I could see that working for me, but not everyone cares about player housing, so it's hardly a universal solution. At the end of the day, I'm really curious to see what they do with Midnight. Silvermoon will be the first hub city that was previously associated with one faction. It is a very bold move, especially in a game like World of Warcraft, where the faction war has been such a huge, fundamental part of the way a lot of players have always engaged with the game. And if they are going to give Blood Elves a reason to remain in the Horde, then it's pretty much now or never. They must have better plans to make it work than just making a section of the city be hostile to the Alliance and leaving their entire attempt to address the void in the storytelling that's being left by the faction war at that, right? If you enjoyed this video, feel free to comment, like, subscribe, follow, tell your friends, all the good YouTube stuff. I'm also on Patreon and would like to thank the names you see before you for helping to make these videos happen. Finally, you can find me streaming both here and on Twitch, where I'm always happy to talk about all things lore. I haven't been streaming a lot lately because I've been packing, but I should be finishing up with moving the day this video comes out. So while that's all for now, hopefully I will see you again soon.